Welcome to Rambam in Depth. Today we'll be discussing the Rambam Hilchos Nachlos, Perek Yud Aleph, halacha Yud Aleph. The Rambam talks about the laws of tzedakah here, which is tangential to the laws of inheritance. And he says the following: someone who became mentally incapacitated, or he became deaf-mute. These are two categories that are exempted from mitzvahs. What about the mitzvah of tzedakah? So the Rambam rules, Bezdin Paiskin Olav Tzedakah Im Hayiroi. If they are able to, if they have the means financially, Bezdin will decide how much they should give and will take their property and give it away to tzedakah. What is the logic behind that? So the Kesef Mishnah says that there is a certain kind of lien on their property. Maimonides shel Adam Mishubad Lases Mimenu Tzedakah. A person's money or property has a lien on it for tzedakah, and therefore they could be forced to give, even though they don't have the ability, the mental ability to decide to give tzedakah. Their property is mortgaged, and the Ketzos, Simon Reis Sadik, Sipkat and Gimel, says that it's just like he compares it to Pidyon Haben. Pidyon Haben is a mitzvah, but because it's a mitzvah, it imposes a monetary obligation on one's property, and therefore one has to give the money whether they want to give it or not. Same thing over here, even though they're not capable of giving their consent, but nevertheless the mitzvah imposes a lien on their property. However, the Avnei Nezer in Yeridea, Siman Kuf Samar Zayin, questions the Ketzos and his analogy to Pidyon Haben, and he says the following, that the reason why there's a lien, property is mortgaged, as it were, for the mitzvah of tzedakah is because there's a mitzvah. But the deaf-mute and the person who's mentally incapable of making any decisions doesn't have a mitzvah. So how could there be a legal obligation? And he brings an example from Pidyon Haben. Pidyon Haben, if the father didn't redeem the child, Taisvus in Bechiris says that the obligation of the child to redeem himself begins when he becomes an adult. Why not before? Even though when he was a katan, he was a minor, he didn't have the obligation, but there's a lien on his property. That's what the law of Pidyon Haben is. But we see from here that lien only activates when the mitzvah begins. When if there's no mitzvah, there's no lien. Same thing's true if the person who was mentally incapable and has therefore no obligation, how could there be a lien on his property? So one possible way of explaining it, and this differentiating between the case of the shaita and the case of the katan by Pidyon Haben, is that the katan was never obligated until he becomes an adult. There was never a mitzvah, so how could there be a lien? If there's no mitzvah, no obligation, how could there be imposed a lien on his property? By contrast, the shaita became a shaita. He already had the obligation. It's a little bit difficult because then we would have to distinguish between, let's say, a person becomes a shaita, a person made $1,000, and in which case the bezin would say he has to give 10%, $100. Then he becomes a shaita, and then he makes another $1,000. You would have to distinguish, and that the money, the $1,000 he made before he became a shaita, he has a lien on his property and he has to give it, and the bezin will give it for him. On the other hand, what happens later, since there's no more mitzvah, he no longer could have any lien on his property. The Rambam doesn't make such a distinction, although the Rambam doesn't usually say halachas that are new, that are not mentioned in the Gemara, but it would seem that distinction would have to be made. So this remains a little bit of a difficulty. But there's another thing the Avnei Nezer focuses on. The Kesef Mishnah over here says that the reason why, if a person goes away, person who was obligated to give tzedakah, and he goes on a trip, we don't take his property to give to tzedakah. Why not? There's a lien on his property. So the Kesef Mishnah gives two explanations. One explanation he gives that we assume that every person wants to give tzedakah. That's another reason why you can take his property, because we assume that he wants to give tzedakah. That's normal assumption. That's why the person who becomes mentally incapacitated, you can take his money because we assume that he wants to give tzedakah. But the case where a person goes away and we're not allowed to take from his property, even though we assume that he wants to give tzedakah, because we could assume that he's giving tzedakah there. Why should we force him to give tzedakah twice? He's giving over there. That's the assumption. The Avnei Nezer gives another very ingenious explanation why there's a difference between the tzedakah, when the person is at home, then you can take his property because there's a lien on his property, as opposed to when he goes away. He says there's a question Tosfos asks. It says in the Torah that a person who gives tzedakah is rewarded. And the question that Tosfos asks is that there's a general rule that any mitzvah that the Torah assigns a reward for, we don't force a person to do. Because the Torah is saying, you do it, you get a reward. If the Torah doesn't give you a reward, the Torah is telling you that you have to do it whether you like it or not. But here it seems the Torah is telling you there's a reward, so if you like it, you'll get a reward. If you don't like it, you won't get the reward. So that's a general rule that a mitzvah aseh, a positive commandment, where the Torah gives you on the spot, gives you a reward, assigns a reward for it, you cannot force the person to do it. Bezdin does not force a person to do it. Tzedakah, Bezdin could force a person to give. There's a lien on his property, as we said before. So then why is it that you can force him when the Torah gives you a reward? The Torah says that for giving tzedakah, God will reward you, He will bless you. So Tosfos answers, tzedakah is not just a mitzvah as a positive commandment, it's also a mitzvah leisasa. It says in the Torah, leisa ametz levavcha, don't close your heart. Leisikib says yadcha, don't close your hands. And therefore, negative commandments, you can force a person to observe even if there's a reward assigned to it. And therefore, when a person is not at home, you can't force him to give tzedakah, take some of his property and give it to tzedakah. Why? Because the negative commandment only applies when a person closes his heart and his hand, is when the poor person is right there asking for help and you say, no, I'm not going to help you. But when he's not there, you can't say he's violating the negative commandment. He didn't close his heart. He's not even aware that there's a need. So there's only a positive commandment. If there's only a positive commandment, then you can't force a person to do it because there's a reward assigned for it. So that's why when the person is home and doesn't want to give tzedakah, the bezdin can force the person to give tzedakah. Same thing is true with the person who became mentally incapacitated, where he doesn't have had never expressed the desire to give tzedakah. Unlike the Kesef Mishnah says we assume he wants to give tzedakah, here we don't have to use that assumption because you can force a person against his will. But that's when the person and the tzedakah are in the same place. But when the person travels away from home and not giving tzedakah would only be a violation of the positive commandment, there is no din of kfiyah, there's no din of coercion.